YouTube, what is good? Welcome back to the channel. Today we are talking about something pretty exciting, which is Harman Phoenix 200 is now available in 120 format. And that's great news. Obviously, the 35mm format has existed for some time now. It's a big release, and everybody's very excited. And now we're bringing some of that excitement over to here, to the 120 format. So this film is the exact same film emulsion, but you're going to experience that emulsion a little bit differently, given that the negatives now are going to be much bigger. So generally pretty similar to before, but a couple kind of specific differences that you might notice. So in terms of exposure, this film is definitely something that you need to consider overexposing, in my opinion. It's rated at 200, but in my experience and in other people's experience, giving it at least another half a stop or maybe a full stop of light is pretty useful, because most of the time your shadows are just going to go to black very, very quickly. You do need to think about this though, because this film does have a bit more limited dynamic range compared to your typical color negative films. So you compare this to a Kodak Portra 400, for example, there's definitely less dynamic range currently as this film exists. And because of that less dynamic range, you need to sometimes choose between exposing for your highlights or exposing for your shadows. If you do one versus the other, you're going to sacrifice a little bit of the other one. In my opinion, I typically don't like blowing out highlights because I think that looks worse than crushed shadows. So I tend to kind of expose more to the highlights, and therefore let the shadows kind of go wherever they want. That yields a fairly contrasty looking image. This film in general is going to give you contrasty images, but that's just my preference. Looking at examples here, you can see that in a scene like this, where you have just so much more, highlight versus shadow, and it's just all over the place. This film struggles a little bit, but honestly, this scene is challenging for basically any film. You're really pushing the extent here of really bright highlights with really, really deep shadows. So, that's what you can expect. But either way, like, regardless of which one you expose for, there is something appealing about the contrasty look that you get, assuming you like contrast. And I'm definitely one of those people who prefers a bit more of a contrasty look. So given this kind of dynamic range limitation, I would say this film is not ideal for bright sunny days or scenes like that, the Caribbean, really hot places like Florida, stuff like that. If you live somewhere where things are a bit more overcasty, where you get a lot of cloud cover, I think that's where this film really looks its best. And this is something that, Harman themselves have kind of noted in their spec sheets. So if you have that kind of scene on a kind of dreary day, this film is absolutely perfect for that, because those days tend to have a little bit less dynamic range in the scene, and therefore the film can capture as much of that as possible without getting crushed shadows or really blown out highlights. This film does have a pretty strong halation effect, so if you do bring it out in a kind of bright sunny day, whenever that light is reflecting off of anything and hitting the lens directly, you're probably going to get some really strong halation, which I know that's very polarizing. Some people love it, some people hate it. It's here, and it's a signature feature of this film as it is right now. But I am curious over time, as this gets iterated on, as the emulsion evolves and changes, if that's something that's going to stay or if that's something that's going to go. So we'll see what happens with that. I think one really interesting quality to talk about with regards to 35mm versus 120 is the appearance of the grain. This emulsion is the same in both, like I said earlier, and therefore the grain itself is the same size and all of the above. But when you have a much smaller image, like a 35mm negative, your perception of that grain is going to be much more drastic compared to your perception of that grain in a bigger negative, like a 120 6x6 negative. So if you have a face in your negative, that face is going to be substantially smaller in a 35mm negative. And therefore, how that face looks with the grain that's already built into the emulsion, it's going to be a little bit different than how that same face with the similar composition is going to look in a 6x6 negative, where the grain again is the same exact size, but now that face is physically larger when you compare the two negatives next to each other. So I wouldn't say that this is technically less grainy, but it appears less grainy because of the bigger image format. And this happens with any film. If you shoot the 35 versus the 120 format, that's probably one of the big things you'll notice. The question is, do you want that to happen? Some people like to have heavy grain in their images, and therefore if they shoot with this bigger format, that's going to be a little bit less apparent, and that might be a stylistic choice that you don't want to make. Sometimes it's the opposite. Some people want fairly sharp images in 120, which I think this will give you, but then if you step down to the 35, that grain's going to maybe take away from that perceived sharpness. So again, it's all about perception and opinion and taste, but just know that that perception is going to be slightly different between the two different options because of the size of the negative. And all of that perception is really affected also by the output medium. So whether you're printing in the darkroom, like I'm going to show you in a little bit, or if you're scanning. So when we talk about the aesthetics of this film and we talk about quality, you really got to talk about scanning. Scanning, if you're going to present your images digitally on the computer, Instagram, whatever, scanning is essential here, because this film does not give you kind of beautiful scans out of the box. And that's kind of something that everybody knows here. You really have to scan this film properly, and then you really have to edit these scans properly to get what looks very natural, if that's what you're going for. This doesn't matter where you're doing camera scanning or if you're sending it to a lab. Those machines are kind of calibrated towards existing film stocks, which all have that kind of orangey, dark colored base. This film has a very different color base. This one's very purpley, very blue. It's a very cold base. And that fundamentally will give you a different looking scan out of the box. So for any scan that I do, I find I have to go into Negative Lab Pro and use that tool in order to alter the colors and the exposure. Or you can do it in Photoshop, Lightroom, whatever software you have. But typically what you get out of the box, if you're doing camera scanning or any scanning for that matter, is going to have to be edited to some degree. I find that you really have to make things a little bit less blue when you're scanning. So you have to add in a bit of the warmth, add in a bit more magenta, and that typically gets you in the right direction. So make sure you scan this properly. And if you do get scans back from a lab that you don't like, before you write off your images, play with them. Put them in the software, mess around with them, edit the color balance, the temperature, all that stuff. And I bet you for a lot of those shots, you're probably going to get something you actually really like. But that's just something that's a given with this film as it exists right now. You have to carefully and thoughtfully scan them. So I mentioned the enlargers. Let's actually look at some prints. And I love printing in the darkroom with any C41 film because that's where you truly get to see what the capability of that film is in terms of its color and kind of dynamic range and all that stuff. So I've got a print that I made right here. And actually I made two of them. They're the same exact print, same setting, same everything. I just always make two just in case one is less than perfect. And here you really see, I think, how this film can handle a scene. This scene has pretty high dynamic range, even though most of it is in the shadows, but you can see behind the subject here, there's bright white, and that's due to the reflections of the sun on the basketball court behind the subject. But you get to see the subject's skin tone, which I think this film actually does very well with darker skin tone. You really bring out some of the color in the skin. It doesn't kind of wash out a bit as it does with some of the portrait stocks. And I noticed that before when I was shooting on the 35mm version, but very evident here as well on the 120. There's some nice hue to the skin color here. I think it actually makes this subject look pretty good. And then you see kind of the shadows, the midtones, highlights, and then the dark shadows up here. So this image is very contrasty. And typically when you do color printing in the darkroom, there's not really much you can do about contrast. So you get kind of the true contrast of this film. Here you're seeing that as well. This film is as contrasty as it appears. And you can see it on the print here. You can see it in the scans. It's just part of how this film functions. And I think that's probably due to the shorter or less dynamic range. But let's compare this here to the scan. That's kind of the difference you can expect when you do scanning versus printing. There is a lot more you can do when you scan in terms of editing, because digital tools let you manipulate all kinds of stuff. In the darkroom, you can only really manipulate the exposure itself, so brightness and that kind of thing, and then the color balance depending on the CMY scale. Outside of that, there's not really much more you can do. So honestly, I'm pretty excited about this film existing in 120. I actually do like the look of it in specific situations. Like I said, it's not right now. It's not something that I would take with me anywhere for just kind of my typical work that I'm doing out in the streets, because I don't know what to expect at the end of the day. Or I do know what to expect, like we talked about in this video, but that is going to potentially take away from the results that I'm trying to achieve. So right now, I'd probably save this film for more casual use, travel, hanging out, that kind of stuff. And as it improves, as they keep working on it and iterating on it, as those chemists at Harman keep working on it, hopefully this does get much more capable, because I really do like kind of the contrast that you get from this film. It's a very specific look. It's got something right out of the box that's interesting. If not, it's definitely not perfect though. So we'll see how it goes in the future, but I'm pretty excited because I trust Harman. I love the dedication they have to the film community. And clearly this is something they're putting a lot of money and a lot of effort and work and time into. So having them make film is massive, because if they're making film, that's a good sign. That means it's not going anywhere. All right, that's the video for today. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you did, please like the video. And of course, comment down below. Let me know what your thoughts are with the Harman film. I feel like this film, some people love it and other people are just like, it's not for me. So I'm curious, does this change your opinion on it? The fact now that you have it in 120 and you can really kind of get a slightly different look out of it, depending on how you shoot it. Does that change anything for you? All right, y'all, to the next one. I'm out.